Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's start this welcome reception session. The welcome reception of AIDA AICET2025 is sponsored by Cook Medical, and I have the pleasure to introduce you Dr. Yannis Pandelidis, that is lead engineer of Cook Medical. Cook Medical is located in the US, and one of the topics of their interest is interventional MRI. So he's going to present very interesting things about AI healthcare and the era of complexity, and later on also Mr. Paul Verin is going to say a few things about interventional MRI. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Peters. I'm honored to be presenting here at my hometown, living here in Agnatia, and Sofia is not very far from here, so growing up, so it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Today I'd like to talk about the relationship of artificial intelligence, healthcare, and the era of complexity, what I call this, basically because it is AI has enabled us to move to the next era, I think, in the whole area, basically. So I want to talk about, I'm going to give you some overview of the things that I'll talk about. I'll give a little bit of a AI history and the AI history flavors. Then I'll talk about the model of control systems, because I think that this is what is a proper way of seeing and formalizing what we're seeing. And then I want to model essentially economic and healthcare as control processes and agents as controls. And so this would actually allow the formalization of how we're thinking and becoming more scientific. And then I want to link it also to complexity and link it back to the era of complexity that I'm saying. So what is intelligence? Because it's the ability for analysis, synthesis, learning, and adaptation. And artificial intelligence is the non-human intelligence. But as I will point out later on, we're actually moving towards abstraction, meaning that whenever you think of whether it's artificial or human intelligence, ultimately we have to be thinking of intelligence as an abstract operation. The AI evolution has been basically created through a revolution in both in methods and algorithms, the neural networks, large language models, etc., but also in software coding, not just the algorithms, but also, for instance, the DeepSeek, where it actually does the same algorithm, but then works on the code, let's say on the machine level rather than that, and that presents a tremendous improvement in efficiency. And then, of course, the data itself, so it has become big data, especially through the process of paper to digital transition. This is a big driver. And the hardware, of course. We CPU to GPUs through NVIDIA, which is now a $4 trillion company, by the way. And ultimately, if you look forward, and there's probably going to be, we're talking in the computation area, we will be looking at optical computers and quantum computers pretty soon, so that could very well change. I want to talk a little bit about different flavors of AI, because really till a few years ago, AI didn't necessarily just mean neural networks. Now people associate that, but it's actually much deeper, much greater subject that has been around for a very long time, from the at least the 50s, when both ideas of symbolic and neural networks have been created. So I'll talk a little bit about that, that not just what people have heard about now, neural networks, but also other aspects. For instance, I will talk about the symbolic and semantic AI, because which has been inspired primarily from the field of logic, computer science, philosophy, and psychology. So this is, and essentially, it's the abstract part of the symbolic stack. It's the higher end of the symbolic stack. Machine learning was basically mathematics. It's inspired by essentially mathematics and statistics. Whereas the neural network deep learning models were inspired by biology, the brain, but also by physics and electrical engineering concepts like half-field networks, etc. There's a lot of electrical engineering concepts. And then we proceed to now what we're moving to agentic AI, which and AI systems, which is inspired by systems and control theory and network theory, which is basically what I'm saying, that the formalism ultimately to understand things perhaps is more the control theory of how to look at the whole thing as a whole and not just pieces of that. And the other part is that I'm also including AI as essentially the signal processing, image processing, etc., that has been around for a long time. As myself having both electrical and mechanical engineering background, we were doing, networks, so convolution networks, all of these things were standard ways of managing, at least, and not just digital knowledge, but also analog, right? So when I think of, people talk about the digital revolution, but I think of more of the information revolution, because we also are working with analog signals a lot, so this, and images, etc. So it's not just that. And so this is inspired, I think, by electrical engineering and information theory. Now, when we develop models is a very interesting thing, because I think we live in a world of symbols. So everything is a model. Even when you think of reality, I think it's actually, we have a model of reality. So in machine learning models, we have, again, just essentially mathematical formulations of how you link in input and output. Another ways of thinking about it is that how you might actually transform explicit data to implicit forms. This is something that David Bohm, for instance, talked about. Okay. All right. It's so you can think of this as essentially changing observations or data to models, so the explicit form of the implicit form. If you think of a table of points, the actual points are the explicit data. The line is what you call the model. So it's a general with that. And then, of course, we have the neural networks and the deep learning model, where in this case, we are really transforming the language space, which is expressed in tokens, essentially one word, one token, approximately, we're transforming this to the mathematical vector space. So this is like, it's the transformation of a language space to a vector space and an associated metric space or mathematical space, and then ultimately relates back to the language space to talk to you. So this idea, the concept of transforming one space to another, and to transforming your own problem from one space to another in mathematics and in engineering is very well understood. We change things, let's say, from the time domain to the space, to the frequency domain, solve the problem, come back to the time domain if we want to. So this is kind of a general, again, process that we use in...
there is an issue.
Okay.
Sorry. Because from the Zoom, we have to share our screen in order the participants to see.
Okay, share that,
Yeah. All right. We share a screen too. Share. All right. All right. I think we're okay now.
Okay. So we have the other type of models. Again, we have semantic or knowledge graphs, which is again representations, not as opposed to the neural networks of symbolic information, semantic information, their relationship to that. And that has a very long tradition that I'll talk about some. And some of the model features are either, when you create these models, are they compressive? Like if you take an image, you create a category. Let's say the dog, it's a compressive transformation, whereas now the generative, you take the category or the specific and you generate it. So from, let's say, an abstract concept like dog, you generate the image of a dog. And then we have the different types of tokens. You might have just a different type, just a single tokens representing language, but we also can abstract it to multiple types. I want to talk a little bit more about the symbolic AI. We started, this is again, the symbolic AI and semantic AI goes back just as long as the neural networks has. And it's basically originally created by trying to represent abstract information. So essentially working on a higher symbolic level stack. We used like languages like Prolog and Lisp, and it was basically essentially trying to come up with inference, logical inference based on certain rules, abstract rules. So in Prolog, for instance, we had two facts. Let's say the parent of John and Maria, of John is Maria, and the parent of Maria is Dorothy. And if you put in grandparent and use John, comma, X, it would say X is Dorothy because you have the rule generated by the rule says that the grandparent of X is Y if the parent of X is Z and the parent of Z is Y, and therefore that's an inference. And it's a very abstract thing. You can't, this is not something that comes with numbers, it's actually the logic, right? And so we had applications in expert systems. Then came this semantic AI, which was a sequence of ways of how to represent knowledge in a structured way, in classes and subclasses, ontologies, taxonomies, etc., which create abstract knowledge representations. It's a natural representation for high-level knowledge representation, because the kind of other things that we've been doing, like images, etc., are considered the low level in the symbolic stack. And then we have part of that, typically in a semantic AI, you have a knowledge graph, a representation of your concepts, and then you match it with an inference engine, and that produces inferences from that. And you can also ask it questions, like using different methods like Sparkle, etc. So here is the typical, like a knowledge graph that says this is how different entities relate to each other. They have properties, we call it data properties, and then object properties when it's relations to each other. And I actually am building, I have a knowledge graph myself to understand our own situation in Cook Medical, which is, by the way, Peter, Mr. Polverini will talk more about our company, but you can see here that I've created a knowledge graph, and all of those intermediate things that you see are little categories that are not showing up, but it's just one. I had patents or organizations and contacts and a whole bunch of other concepts that are not showing because I'm not showing, depending on the semantic level that I'm showing, they show up. But I have many different categories that represent the basically knowledge and abstract knowledge. And I think ultimately AI will combine both the semantic parts and the neural networks, I think. So I think we will be going towards more multimodal AI, I think. Again, the machine learning models, I think you probably are lot more familiar with those things, creating mathematical models of regression, classification, etc. So essentially, again, the whole point is to have data X and Y typically, and then come up with some predictions, classifications, etc. What preceded the breakthroughs based on large language models were things like natural language processing, which was we used it for instance for specific domain-specific natural language processing, where you extract entities, like in the clinical notes, for instance, when we have a lot of data in the medical databases, we have a lot of structured data, like that can be represented by relational databases, but we also have a lot of clinical notes associated with each patient. So typically, when I would be taking data from if I have a specific patient, I didn't want to just have their medical history and drugs, etc., but I also wanted the clinical notes, because I was trying to figure out whether, for instance, there is evidence of an adverse event, and then I'd have to analyze what happens to the clinical notes itself. So we'll go further. Let's move on. In the deep learning neural networks, it's again basically a translation from the language world to the mathematical space, or the logic space to the mathematical space. You look at, let's say, you think of a book as a word sequence, many things, but it's a sequence, it's actually one after the other, and you transform these, typically a token could be a word or part of the word, etc., but that's the general aspect. And then what you do is you represent, for each token, you represent the vector representation for that. So a very simple symbol in the high level word, which would be, let's say, a queen or a king, well, you represent it with a vector. Of course, that vector is a 1,000-dimensional vector. So with the word queen has actually 1,000 different numbers represented with it. The same thing with a king, there's 1,000 things. So, and then it turns out the things that you do in the logical space have a correspondence to what happens in the vector space. So you think that if I expect that if they're semantically related, and that the vectors king and the vectors queen must be close, either in distance and in angle, and also the concept of male and female could also be related to that. So you could think of arbitrarily that, if I am the king, the vector king, and I take it, but have the female, then I should get the vector queen from that, essentially. Or if I am in the queen and I add the vector male, the opposite direction, I should get to the king. So this, again, what I have found in general, that we have a whole theory about how we move from spaces to spaces, and those, there is in fact a very beyond systems theory. There are deeper theories, mathematical theories called category theory and topos theory, that talks exactly about that if you have one space and another space and somehow they're related, you can actually have a whole space with its own logic and its own rules, and then transform into another space that has its own logic and its own rules. And so this happens to be, to me, the biggest, the best way to generalize what's happening here, because that's how I interpret all of these different areas together. Now, when we talk about AI deep learning models, we have both compressive and generative models. We started with the compressive, meaning that we were getting, for instance, from the content, from clinical notes, we extracted the codes, like which drugs were used, what device was used, what was the disease state, the thing, which was we called it named entity extraction. We just to extract something, whereas the generative, you say, well, I want to see this and generate something for that. So one contracts information, the other expands information. And then we had, of course, we developed foundation models, and on top of these, fine-tuned models that for each specific area they could use the foundation and modify it for that, fine-tuned. And then you have a retrieval augmented generation working, extending that with the world. And then we had reinforcement learning where you actually have the child and say, well, I'm not keeping you here, I'm just letting you go out there and actually experience the real world. And then we're now coming out to what we call the agentic models and the systems, which actually come back to control theory, meaning that this is now as understood as a control problem, that you can think of it as a hierarchical control, for instance, and you say, I'm going to create a story, well, I have the head agent, the head controller is the editor, but then I have other agents that have different functions and they go and do things and then report back and we collaborate and we decide things. So this thing is coming back to the model of the control model that I talked about. So this is like typically an agentic multimodal system would have a co-pilot, an autopilot, some head agent, and you have lead agent and a follow agent, and each one of these we might have a different task to do. You know, go there, get so it's task and subtask essentially, and so you can have Now, one of the things that we're also seeing that when we're looking at what is happening in the world here, we're talking about information space, I'm talking of virtual space or cyberspace, but it's really, to me, in general, an information space and the physical space. And those things the information space contains like knowledge and intelligence. It's basically things that are symbolic or low-level symbolic. I'm thinking a bit of a pixel is also a symbol, but the lowest level of the symbolic stack. But then you think of happiness, freedom, those are the highest in the symbolic stack. And so, but those belong to the information space. And also, the information space follows its own rules. It's not physics. It's not tied to physics. It's consistent with physics, but it's not tied to that. And so it's, whereas the physical space is that of action of physical things, medical devices. If you think of how we actually construct a control system in general has both an information space of how to, and then interacts with the physical space, like actuating. So you have an edge device that you extract information. So from the edge device, you actually transform the physical space into the information space, and then you figure out what to do, and then you have an action, and you send it out, and you want an actuator to transform your information space to the energy space. So this is information and entropy, and with energy are closely associated, and we're now shifting further and further into the information space, which is, so when think about knowledge and intelligence, again, it has to be thought as part of a larger system, but essentially knowledge is either declarative, this is what it is, or procedural, methods, this is how you do things. So typically you will see that the procedural knowledge becomes declarative knowledge. So this is how you do it, but in the end, it's like, well, what is it? Or what is going to be? So, and then the intelligence is actually the processing of that knowledge. And so in our case, for instance, in a control system, a declarative knowledge would be about, well, what is the diagnosis? You know, what are the data? What's the diagnosis? Then you would say, okay, what do I do? Oh, that's procedural. Do you know this is it? Do you have the knowledge, the procedural knowledge to do something about it? So that's procedural knowledge. And then the intelligence is, putting it all together. And so when we think about models now, Wittgenstein had talked about we make pictures of, of the world. So we always work in models. It's just everything, reality is types of models that we create about how we understand the external reality within ourselves. And what I consider here is that we're going towards an ideal model. I feel that the ideal is the driver of innovation, meaning thinking what people call vision. In mathematics, we have the same thing called the ideal. What is the absolute best that you can possibly do? You think of that, and then you think, where am I? And this is then you can say, I want this is my vision, the ideal. Well, we're here, how do we get there? And then, of course, all the other things happen. But I think this is an actual driver, which also drives all innovation. So we have, and I see when you say an ideal, what you mean by that, but part of these things are completeness, meaning that you have a model of healthcare. Well, we don't really. We need explicit models, and we need deep models, not shallow. And so I'm thinking when we are working on understanding the interaction of the medical device with the MRI, for instance, machine, etc., we need to creating deep models, thermal models, biological models, physics models, kinematic, etc., to understand what is really going on. So, and typically you have either empirical models, like from data you create something and you think if that's the case, if I see this, oh, this must be the model because I fit it to the data, right? But you also have theoretical models. If you think in physics, it wasn't just, we plotted data. Actually, there was a very deep mathematical models that came down. So I also don't think even in medicine, when people talk about evidence-based medicine, I think it is a bit called model-based data, because we're not just looking at data, we actually have medical theory, we have biology with physics, etc. And typically there is a gap. This is either good or small or large, but that could also is the one that drives whether, for instance, your model is adequate or not. And this is typically, you can see that happening in physics, where with the data that we're seeing versus the models that we create, theoretical physics models don't match up right now, for instance. Now here I have another concept of levels of reality. So because we always ask what is real and what is not, and my first question is Santa Claus real? Well, it's real to a child. It's actually more real than your uncle that shows up once every while at Christmas time and for 2 hours, whereas the child has actually thought about and interacted with Santa Claus quite a lot more than your uncle. Similarly, I asked the same question here with our stent. We're developing, for instance, a bioabsorbable stent. Is that real? Well, kind of, but it's not quite. Why? Because we're still in the preclinical stage. We developed it, you can take it, you can show it, you can squeeze it and test it out, but it's not really real because it hasn't gone through the clinical stages and it's not in the market. So to me, I consider that each time you reach closer and closer to reality. So from the information conceptual world comes out to something that gains more and more reality. So you can see also what is happening in the different development stages is that we have the interplay, both the entity and the operator and the entity you have models for both, and they keep getting bigger and more complex as they go on to becoming more and more real. For instance, here we have initially, you can think of on the conceptual stage, you have a CAD model of the device and a CAD model of this, or some simulation model, so that's in your conceptual information space, and then say, okay, let's build it. Okay, so now you create a prototype. Well, that's a little closer. Is that the real thing? Well, it's kind of like, it's actually, I would say, it's a real by coming a little closer to reality. And so finally, so in each case, the model of the entity, the entity for us is the patient, right? But right before that, in the preclinical stage, the model of the patient is actually the pig. And before that, the model of because we're testing things in IMRI, well, we have what we call in the, you have a pig meat that you're working on. So it's again a model of what you want, but a partial model, and then the model we talk about, so the digital twins, but I would call that these would be conjugate twins, conjugates, because a patient is not a twin to the pig, but they're conjugate models of that. So the pig represents, it's a model of the patient, and so they're all related. So I can see them being, again, I see them at different spaces. That one is more of a probability space. It's such a conceptual, anything can go. You can do things in the information space, and then the probability decreases each time you have a funnel that you have fewer and fewer candidates, but they have a lot more value because now they have been selected, they've been improved. So is a very typical process also. If you think of in the drug development, you start out with a target of 10,000 possible molecules. When you start going through each of these stages, it's a filtering process. So at the beginning, 10,000 means you're in the probability space. And then towards the end, you end up with 2, 3 things that maybe one of them might make it, 2 might make it. So now it becomes deterministic. You can see how from one world is an information probabilistic world, and then comes deterministic, and very similar to what we end up in physics when we talk about quantum mechanics. It's all about probabilities, and then but we are having the gravitational theory that is deterministic. So, but we're seeing the same thing here. As we move up the symbolic ladder, things become more and more real and more deterministic. And deterministic means also that the uncertainty keeps being of which one is going to make it. And so every time we have fewer things, but the higher probability of success, they're closer to, and so that means that what you're watching, what we're seeing is that an increasing value going from an information space to the preclinical, the clinical, to the market, etc. So if you think of the stages that they go through, is becoming more and more valuable. And that, I think now, we have the computational capacity to actually be very explicit about what we mean by value. So I can say, this is the target. For instance, in product development, when you're targeting something, we know what the market value is. If you're developing this for diabetes, for instance, this is a $400 billion market. So it's not, and if you say something, well, that have a once in a million, to make it, okay, you have some value, but then if you have 3 drugs or whatever, they come up with a higher probability of success, but the expected value of that is also the probability of success and the market, the expected addressable market. So that gives you there is a fundamental basis for value. And so what I'm looking at is that we are looking towards world models and explicit deep mechanism models, not shallow, you get X and Y, can we make a plot? Well, that's nice, that's a first pass. I see the same thing is happening with evolution. Natural evolution is a trial and error thing, that it works, but it's very, very inefficient, right? Well, all of a sudden we've transformed it by knowing what the genomics, the genetic code and the physics of that. We now can start doing evolution by design. And so by developing deep model, now we have a much larger capacity to innovate. So now I want to get back to the control theory, because I think that if you think about the artificial intelligence as processing intelligence, you normally, in the end, you look for what is the capability of somebody, right? They just say, well, he's intelligent, but that doesn't tell me a lot. Does he know things? Is he intelligent? And can he act? So this whole thing is really, so all of these things I consider to be essentially the control is a top level conceptual, that the others are subservient to that. Even information theory or communication by itself doesn't mean anything. You can talk anything, but if you can see if this communication is top down from the general to the soldier, or the soldier to the general, there's a very big asymmetry. It's not, so information by itself will not tell you anything. And so you need to have the structure of the hierarchy, for instance, to understand and have meaning. So I also think that control theory provides meaning versus the things that are not abstract. So we have the history of control systems, starting from, I am Greek, so I have to start with the hero of Alexander as the first you mentioned, moving on to the governor, which is the first actual feedback control. That was the basic innovation for James Watt, was the governor, which allowed controlled steam. And then we moved on to the Norbert Wiener at MIT. He developed like radar. They made some big breakthroughs in radar, and then rocket science. Literally, people like Kalman and Leutenberger, etc. And now we are seeing that we're talking again, what we're seeing is our controls. We're talking about the plane autopilot, originally in the plane, but we also don't allow the pilot, even though they do autopilots, you don't leave the 747 without the pilot, even though they can do it. But we do allow drones, and now again we're abstracting things, because that's another thing that we're seeing, is that we're having, and not just a drone, but a group of drones. It's like they call it swarms, but in mathematics it's like you have one or you have the group, which is the greater thing. And now we're talking about autonomous vehicle, or autonomous agent, an agent. All of those can be understood as part of control theory. And if you think of just the agent, then you're basically talking about the information space control. That somebody says, okay, I think you can buy another stock, but that's all information. But an autonomous vehicle is bigger than that. It combines both the information space and the physical space together. You need the actuation, for instance. And so here are some things. So my point is that we can think of basically the control system as the autonomous vehicle, or the control system structure. And then you can think of the economy and healthcare as control systems, and subordinate. These other things, I consider them subordinate fields, whether you're doing AI, information theory, etc., because the meaning is derived by the bottom line, which is what do you do with control. And one of the things that I'm thinking in abstract terms is that we have different spaces that we can understand the world. The first is that command space. What do you want? The target. What is so? Then, if you want that, well, how do we do it? Well, this is the control space, meaning that, okay, I have a control space that I can actually identify the entity that I want to move, let's say the vehicle. That's the thing that and then I need an observer to put all the data together, like vision systems, lasers, etc. It turns out, for instance, Tesla, for instance, does not, uses only vision and nothing else, which I think, are you sure you want to do that? Because in terms of completeness, I'm saying you have all of this other data that you should, other people are collecting, and you choose not to ignore it. I think this could be a big problem. But then you have a controller actuating the brake, the wheel, those are things. But notice that again, and so the controller, the accelerator, these are what to do, right? I want to stop, I want to go, but if they're low, these are in the information space, low energy, high information, whereas the actuation is actually the car engine, this relationship. You just turn on or turn off, and from one bit of information, something very big happens in the world. So this world is associated with information and all entropy and information theory and channel capacities and all this stuff. And the other is about energy. So they're different worlds. And then for everything that I see, everything below that, and say, well, in order to do this, I need what? Oh, I need fuel, I need capital, I need, that's a resource space. So I consider like energy as a resource. It's like, I want to do this, okay, so I see it coming from top down, and the bottom is a resource, which I associate, for instance, energy or capital, things. So if you look at the control system structure itself without the command and the energy, it turns out to be the command space, what you want to do, the control space, and the research space. That's it that we talked about. Now, let's talk about the healthcare intervention space, meaning that we have a surgery, for instance. This is again, but what is your command? The command is like improve the health state. This is and then you say, so that's my target. I want to improve healthcare. The control space will say, okay, what is the entity? The entity is the patient. It's not a vehicle now. And now I have an observer. What do? I collect data, laboratory data. I figure out diagnosis. So from data, scanning the data, I come up with some higher level, symbolic level, which is the diagnosis. Then I move into the controller. It's what do I do? So this is the diagnosis. What is the actuation? You need to run this procedure. For us, it's like, you have prostate cancer, stage 1 and this thing. Okay, then I'm going to do ablation. I'm going to do cryoablation, for instance, to take it out. So that, and then the actuation is like, this is my plan, right? I'm planning to do this. The actuation is like, well, let's actually do it. So it's a physical thing. It's the actual getting from the planning stage within the information world to the physical world. And then your research space is like, so again, all the things that you need as resources. In our case, actually, you could think of even the drugs or the devices and resources to do what you want. So I want to do this. What do I need? Well, I need this and that. So it's actually, if you think of the hierarchy, it's the procedure that matters, how you do it, and then you say, well, what do you need? I'll need this drug, I'll need this device, I need these tools. Again, I will extend it to the whole economy. You have, what are the target entities in the economy? From a control point of view, there's either the person, the business, or the government. So if you take a B2C, for instance, as business to consumer, and then you say that's the entity, you look at the entity needs, like the health needs, existential health needs. So that's the problem. What is the problem with health need? And then you transform that problem you formalize it into a health state. So that you become from a qualitative to some quantitative, formalized thing, which is the health state, and then your goal is to improve health state. Same here now with the health state, then we have formalized and standardized things. When I'm saying the nice thing in the healthcare space and why it's so interesting and challenging is that everything is actually very formalized. It's that other things, business in general, if you're talking about movies or whatever, you can do business, but what's the problem? What is the solution? I have no idea. This is like a very, very abstract. But in healthcare, we know precisely what that means. If there is prostate cancer, I have an ICD-10 code for that because we have codes for each one of these, and associated with each code we have a hierarchical taxonomy, which means that we can assign a value to each of these things. And say the whole cancer, for instance, is $500 billion market. Everything below that, the taxonomy is has to have a consistency, numerical, mathematical consistency for that. So all of these things in healthcare represent a great lab case, basically, for saying how do you actually develop in science of innovation. So I want to show you then, so in general, we have the observer space here, right, in healthcare, the symptoms and the lab data and the diagnosis. We have the controller, here the control procedure, the options, and then the planned procedure. And then the actuation space is, do you take the drug or you place a stent on it, etc. But it's this. When you think of the healthcare industry as an economy, again, you can think of it as a hierarchical control system again. The payer is in the command and the financial stage because it says, I want to take care of these things, and I'm give you this energy. So it's I'm give you the target, I'm in the command space, I want that, and I give you the energy space. You know, this is your budget, energy budget. And then you do something with it. And it's what I consider that you take the energy that is amorphous, you know, liquid cash, and you transform it into something that becomes, you know, an actualized thing with a high potential energy. So I see it like a kinetic energy to potential energy transformation. So in the command level, the financial level is the driver. So that also has implications. When you start thinking of things in a control theory, you can also say, well, what matters? To me, it's like, oh, if this is a hierarchy, the payer that is the driver, whoever that is. And sure enough, this is what happens. In health insurance is the one that can be, or whoever is the payer, whether it's the person, the insurance, or the government, that can demand certain things from the provider. The provider doesn't have the same incentive as you. They're just doing their job. So you have healthcare groups, hospitals, et cetera, the health operator, the physician, the nurse, the technologist, et cetera. And then below that is like, well, how do you achieve this? Well, you have drugs, you know, therapeutic things, your drugs, medical devices, and also even below that, you have something, instead of the products, you have capital equipment, like medical imaging equipment, which all provide the infrastructure. They don't show up right away. So the things become either, you know, visible or not visible. You don't see that, you know, normally. Here is the typical thing, like what happens again is that we have an abstraction, meaning that if I have from a control point of view, if I know that this is the state of the patient X is at this, and this diagnosis is actually the state of the patient, I'm thinking F of X, you know, I'll operate on it. So whatever you do with the X, I do a service, something, to work on that. And that you'll find, for instance, that you've seen that we have transformed everything into a service, even though originally things were thought of as products. And when they say, well, you don't think of it as a product, you think of it as a procedure because of that. Because if I'm operating on the state, I think of what the operation is, what the service is on that. Everything else becomes subordinate to that. So we have the target, and so the procedure, and when we formalize these things, now in clinical trials, we actually have a very specific way of formalizing. When you do a drug, a new drug, you actually have a very specific way in specifying we're going to operate on you, why, who's the, if we're going to recruit a patient, who's going to be that? Well, it has to be adult male. I don't have children, can't be over, whatever. You know, what is the target indication? What is you're addressing? You know, what's the problem? What's your solution to that? What's your methodology? And then, what is your protocol? How are you going to do this? Are you going to do it with cryoablation? Are you going to do it thermal ablation, et cetera, et cetera? And below that says, oh, by the way, for that, I need this device. I need these surgical instruments. I need this device. So there is definitely a very definite structure to how things happen. And they can, what I see is that as we're creating greater computational capacity, we can have more and more explicit models, world models, explicit deep models, mechanisms, not correlations, but causal things. So it's not statistics, it's actually the real thing, you know. And so we talked about that. So what is interesting about that is that in each case, in the healthcare space, and that's what is, again, so interesting, is that it actually you have the formal structures. When you say I did the observations that took laboratory data, it means you actually created, you used a lab code. You know, then lab codes are typically LOINC, what they call LOINC codes. We have a very, very deep taxonomy with thousands and thousands of things, but you can say, when you're saying, I took, this is what I did, like say, you know, blood count, complete blood count, this means you'd used ICD-10, you know, lab LOINC, this number for that. So it's very precise. And then you say, from my general observation, I'm still in observative space, but I wanted to say, what does it mean to me, not just data? Well, now you have a diagnosis. Well, it's an ICD-10 code. This is, again, something very specific. The same thing within controller. When you're saying, I'm gonna operate on this and I'm gonna use this procedure, it has a CPT code, what they called it, the procedure code, which is again very well defined, and that's how you actually, the payer, that's how you get your money. It claims, in the claims, you'd say, this is the procedure I did, and this is the diagnosis I did. So I have this claim, I worked on this AICET, CPT code, and the supporting evidence is because I had these lab codes and these diagnosis codes. So it's again very mathematical, very well described, so it has, I think, the greatest potential to actually transform healthcare in a very, very deep way. And so this is what I'm talking about, is that we really standardized medical codes, and each of these can be associated with a value. So if you do market analysis, for instance, you can isolate these things, and you can also impose constraints, consistency constraints. If you say this disease is worth 400 billion, well, if you break into 4 parts, they should add up to 400, 100, whatever, they should add up to that. So you can actually have a consistency up and down the taxonomies with this. So typical thing, for instance, you have for one procedure, and again, one problem, multiple solutions, possible solutions. You could do this for the same thing. You could do cryoablation, thermal ablation, you could do microwave, you can do some things, etc. But this is like, again, there is the graphs. And these are, I'm thinking of them in knowledge graphs again, because there's many situation. For this, I can use, this corresponds to that, and for that, I can correspond to this. So this is a complex knowledge graph. Now we come to MRI and intervention MRI, which is our target here. Why is this so important? Why I was so excited about this? Because I saw it from a controls point of view again, and thought, oh my God, MRI gives you the highest contrast, to see what is actually happening. Things that if you use X-rays, etc., you can't. So you have an observer, you have a precision observer, and you can now see things in less than, within a millimeter, less than 10 millimeters, so you can actually see it, and with high contrast, and you can see exactly this. And it's also naturally three-dimensional, because you can take the images and construct them all together. It's not doesn't just come through like the X-rays. And it also has a tremendous advantage that it's safe, because it does not have X-ray radiation. So it's both safe and performance. You have done that. So that's a breakthrough. That means that you can do a biopsy, for instance, with very good precision. But then you come also, not only this, can I not use it for observer, I can also use it as a controller. I can do a intervention now, right? Actuation. I can control. I can actually see that there is, let's say, cancer there, and I can operate on it because I can see it. And so visualization, all the things that we need for artificial intelligence, for instance, allow me to do both what you need, however, is now MRI compatible medical device. That's the catch. And that's what we're working on. So that's the technological advantage, but you can see that it makes sense. You're now going from general operations, general surgery, all of a sudden we're talking about focal therapy. Both focal observer, focal controller. And that's the exciting part. I'm very excited about this field because it puts me, my electrical engineering, my mechanical engineering, my AI, my data science, my robotics, all of the stuff that it turns out they all have a place here. And so you can think of things by applications and the different functions, the payer, and we have, I think we already kind of talked about that, but so we can see some, I will just give you a few examples of breakthroughs in healthcare. One of them was the protein folding problem, which was not a large language model, but it's a system that we use that basically predicted the one-dimensional shape in 3D space from an amino acid sequence, and that was solved by AI. which was a very big unsolved problem before, was a tremendous thing. In the regulatory cases, again, we have used it for patient recruitment and management, matching patients to clinical trials. In the post-market surveillance of product safety, we use natural language processing to extract and understand, for instance, from clinical notes if there is evidence of clinical adverse events, etc. If you think about here in terms of education MRI by process, the areas that we have, what we are looking for research areas in our field is basically in education training. If you can use like artificial intelligence and XR to improve the training, so that would be a big thing. And then from a controls point of view, if you can think of it, the pre-op, the procedure, what can you do to improve the planning, optimization planning? In the intra-op, in the actual real-time control, what can you do to actually have things like a robotic devices or ergonomic devices to act and do real-time control based on thermometry, for instance, and models that we can use. And then, of course, in the post-op, you need to be able to assess and do adaptation. And, here we have also imaging equipment optimization. How do you do better for things with the scanners, for the image, et cetera. So I think we're coming close to the end. It's like, so here by technology, we have things like the reality, augmented reality, whatever, all of these different types of reality. The AI, the data science has opportunities for that. Robotics again, because you can see when you do precision control, robotics start becoming more this. The other is multiphysics modeling. When we're looking at this system, you have electromagnetic, so you have electrical engineering, you have mechanical engineering, what has actually happened, what's the thermal process, what's the biological process, what's the kinematics, the dynamics, etc. So we have simulation and optimization, what they call a digital twins. It's actually simulation, right? This is what we always called about. You have the possibility of smart devices, and we're putting the needles or the catheters. Can they be smart? Can you see them? Can you have a good marking for them? Can they operate? Can they send you information back? You have. And then advanced materials, because we now need things like MRI compatibility, etc. So you need to understand that. And so this is the healthcare future. Patient-centric, again, all these are really standard control theory things. You focus on what is the target, patient-centric, value-based healthcare. And again, I consider, because I look at this hierarchy, I see that this is perhaps the biggest one, because it means I don't want to be, the payer should not be paying for procedures, should be paying for the end result. Because that's the state, right? I want to see that you've moved the needle from this state to that. And then precision medicine, which involves the genomics and precision intervention, which is what we talk about here. And then the other things that we see is globalization, individualization, model-based medicine, standardization, automation, and optimization completeness. So I think I should probably stop here. It's like,
okay, thank you very much, Dr. Pandelidis, for the very nice overview.
Thank you.
Going all the way from theory to practical things related to interventional MRI. Are there any questions? Yes, please. Just a moment, wait a moment, you're going to get a microphone.
Yes, thank you. All right. Okay, great. Yes, indeed, very interesting talk, and I really like particularly this movement. It's very close to the Platonic philosophy of changing the ideal into a real, essentially, form taking place in the actual world. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just do one just for the time's sake, because it was really interesting talk. In control theory, we have the concept of, especially in state systems, of observational and controllable variables. And as you described in the generation towards the end, it seems that you are constantly trying to create a system, the process itself, not the machine itself, but the process itself, to be fully controllable and fully observable, the so-called minimal implementation of the system.
Exactly. I have a lot of other slides that unfortunately I can't, but exactly because of that. This is what I'm saying if you think of the formalism of control theory, it means that then we can talk about all the things associated with that, all the fundamental theorems associated with that, on controllability, observability, fully observable, fully controllable, issues of stability, tracking, tracking stability, natural stability. It turns out it is so deep, and when we look at the mathematics of control theory, it basically covers every single aspect of mathematics. We have used it, in control theory. So that's why I am a proponent of that. You think of it, and the other thing that I say, so control theory is one of the things that I think is, and I put it on top, because then I'd say, information theory, that's interesting, but Shannon even admit, with the information theory, it doesn't have value. He says, I have so many bits. Well, it's all about bits. Well, what does that mean to me? So what? If you don't think about, I'm transforming something to a different level, shifting down in a symbolic level. These are things that have to deal with the hierarchical thinking of control system, whether you're talking about an observer, and so the symbolic thing is an observer symbol, or the command thing, I'm now the one that says go, no go, is a general. It is not the soldier. So generals go, no go, very simple thing, but then 10,000 soldiers remove. So those are things are understood from the control. The other mathematical construct, basically, that I've seen, but I've been trying to put together all of those different spaces, is what I call the category theory, which is an abstraction of set theory, but then an topos theory, which also puts in a whole bunch of other things, like its own logic. For instance, we talked about Aristotelian logic, which excludes Aristotelian logic is used to say the excluded middle. It's either this or that, and there's nothing in the middle. Well, yeah, but maybe not. There's also intuitive logic, and there are different aspects of logic that actually you can have. It's not, the law of exclusive middle is not there. So I have a whole sequence, and what I was also actually have here is that, transition, I can talk about the different levels of the complexity. We have logic system complexity, control system complexity, mathematical complexity, algorithmic complexity. So all of these, and the interesting thing about this, again, is very well understood, meaning when you go over the mathematics from one general space to metric space and norm space, each time you add a concept that helps you, and you make it more and more useful spaces. If you look at Hilbert spaces, for instance, which is the foundation for quantum mechanics, it turns out that it's actually many levels of structure that you have added and assumed that it has all the way to the Hilbert space. But you could have said, you could start with set, metric space, vector space, norm space, etc. So there is also what I see as monotonicity in complexity. I can't talk about the metric space if I have no concept of a set. So each of these things, the Hilbert space is complete, it implies all the others. So it means that there is a monotonicity. When I'm talking in generalities, complexity, and that's why I also have this concept of complexity, is a very specific, it's very well-defined, and so we can trace these things from transition to that transition. And if you look back, just general principles of the simple, complex. Again, we know what this 1D, 2D, static, dynamic, linear, nonlinear. And it turned out this interplay of complexity is in general, from a controls point of view, you think of as, again, I would call it a complexity matching. The problem complexity, the structure, your control structure should have minimum the complexity, the capability matching and overcoming the problem complexity.
There's a principle in a sense. It says that the controller has to have a kind of representation for the system it's supposed to control.
Right. So we have that. So in the control theory, again, the other thing we have in control theory, we say, when you say the target, is the target static? Oh, it's there, the temperature. But this also, we talk about moving targets. Oh, that we immediately know that's a more complicated. Well, in control theory, we say if the target space is S to the N, you have to have a minimum, so many differentiators, you have to have a minimum system of so many integrators to match up. So this kind of matching, again, all of these things are embedded in this, and so that's why I'm so interested about transforming it to the real world and what is more real than the healthcare, right? Because we're talking about lives, and this is what gives you motivation, We're saving lives with this.
It's one of the most proper paradigms for it, indeed.
Yeah, I would like to thank you very much. There is indeed a very strong relation between intelligence and complexity, but maybe this could be a topic of another different workshop
it's very, very
in the future. I would like to thank you very much again.